Hello and welcome back to McClaren Performance. Ralph Hasenhüttl has recently been sacked by Southampton, and I want to take a look at why that is and look at big changes that are happening behind the scenes. So Ralph Hasenhüttl has been sacked after what is probably a pretty bad start to the Premier League season, find themselves in the relegation zone now. I mean, that is no surprise though, as towards the end of last season, they were absolutely terrible as well. In the last 12 games last season, they lost 9 games and only won 1 of those games as well. Because of that, one of the changes they did make, not getting rid of the manager, but instead changing the entire backroom staff underneath him. Alongside that, with a poor start to this season, I think usually when managers get sacked, there's a big reaction of, oh, why has that happened? You know, give him more time. I think everyone's just kind of gone, fair enough. Just looking from the outside, my own opinion before doing a lot of research, he's been in the job for about 3-4 seasons. And ultimately nothing has really happened for them to develop and go forward. So there was really that inevitability of this was going to happen eventually anyway. I think as well, when I was predicting who was going to get relegated this season, Southampton was in that group as well. That wasn't a wild prediction. I think the odds for that happening were the same across everything else. Apparently in the 2021 season, after 13 games, they were actually third in the table, which somebody must have knocked me out at that time. I do not remember that happening. I have no recollection of that at all. Because despite that, they gradually just declined and finished off where they usually finish off, which is the bottom half of the table. Hasenhüttl's most successful season at Southampton was the 2019-2020 season, which is, I think, his full first season in the job. That coincides, I don't think coincidentally, with Danny Ings being injury-free, having a full season, scoring, I think, 22 goals as well. So I think a lot of that comes down to having a striker that is in form. But other than that, Southampton haven't really finished very well under Ralph Hasenhüttl. 11th is the best that they've ever really done. I believe they had a good run in the FA Cup, but other than that, nothing distinct, nothing great that has happened to them. I actually forgot to mention on top of that, I don't know how I could forget that, 2 9-0 losses, one against Leicester and one against Man United as well. That's probably unforgettable and in some ways unforgivable really for a manager to do that. In fact, just before Ralph Hasenhüttl was appointed as manager of Southampton, the club became a majority owned by a Chinese businessman with the name of Zhao Jisheng. He acquired 80% of the club, and he bought that for £210 million. But ultimately then, just recently, sold that majority for £100 million. So ultimately lost £110 million in that deal. The last 4-5 years of Southampton in the Premier League hasn't really been a profitable one, hasn't really been a successful one. There's nothing really of note at all to talk about. Despite all that, I'd say mediocrity, there's still something going on at the club. There are changes that are happening at the moment. Changes happening behind the scenes that I think has ultimately resulted in Ralph Hasenhüttl losing his job. One of those things is, like I talked about, the change in ownership. That 80% now belongs to a new owner. And that is a group called Sport Republic, which is financed by Serbian national Dragan Solak. Alongside that change in ownership, there's also been a bit of a mess when it comes to the actual recruitment as well. While I don't think the new ownership had any plans to actually change the recruitment that was already there, it's something that's really been thrust upon them, as when they came in, Martin Glover, the head of recruitment at the time, had actually left. He was then replaced with Joe Shields, a very talented individual from Manchester City. The problem is now that really only a couple of weeks ago, Joe Shields actually left Southampton to go to Chelsea. So now that's a bit of a problem. They've kind of based everything off his ideas and got players based on his kind of what he wanted, Man City players as well, and he's now left. So that leaves them in a pretty rough place, and again, a bit of a mixed bag with regards to recruitment. Now, with Ralph Hasenhüttl being sacked, there has been a lot of talk about their summer transfer window in which they signed players ultimately had an average age of 22, specifically an average age, I believe, of 22.6. I believe it was Graham Souness on TalkSport that was a bit critical, or very critical, of them doing that after Ralph Hasenhüttl has been sacked. But I think there is some, quite a lot of reasoning behind that. There is some sense to be made of it. For example, the head of recruitment that came in, Joe Shields, he has come from Manchester City. He's a big name within the academy, specialising really in recruiting players between the age of 17 and 23, and that's really where that number of 22 comes from. He's come into the club, and what the philosophy of Southampton has always been is to recruit younger players and develop them on and then sell them for a higher profit. But under Joe Shields, that's been taken really to the extreme. I believe the transfer window before that The average age was around 26, which is around probably the average of any other club really. And obviously now, like we talked about, it's now near the age of 22. 3 of the players that have been brought into the club, 3 of them belong or previously belonged to Manchester City. So you can see that he had a connection there with those players and he's brought them in as well. Aside from that, they brought in a total of 10 players. Ultimately, the highest age of any of those players was 25. So it really is a young group of players that has been brought in. And like I said, this isn't really a great change in what Southampton are doing. It is quite a slight change though. It's obviously a slight shift in recruitment. Their motto, their mantra has always been potential into excellence. So recruiting potential players, training them up, and then selling off for a bigger price. It's been a couple of hectic weeks for them because, of course, then they lost Ralph Hasenhüttl as well. They sacked him. They've also brought in a new manager now, Nathan Jones from Luton. He has, I believe, a speciality in working really on a shoestring budget, and in this case, developing young players as well. So you could argue he would really perfectly suit the plan, the model that Southampton are really trying to implement at the moment. While I'm usually all for that, say for example with Brighton and Brentford, that's really their model as well. I think in this case I'd have to be a bit critical. Specifically, I have no problem at all with having a long-term perspective of recruiting young players, expecting to develop them, having a way of playing and building towards that. That's absolutely fine. But I think you have to have that long-term vision alongside the short-term as well. For example, the season in which they did really well, not really well, the best they have done in quite within that 3 to 4 seasons, that was a season where I said Danny Ings did so well, scored so many goals. But obviously since then he's moved on to Aston Villa. They've never really found a player to replace him. They've never found an out-and-out striker who is scoring a lot of goals. That is obviously the hardest thing to get in the Premier League, in any league. Everybody wants a striker. But a big solution to the problems that Southampton have at the moment would be to recruit a striker. They hired Joe Shields because of his expertise in recruiting young players, identifying players that can be developed to become great senior players, and there's no problem in that. But you do need to have an emphasis as well on recruiting players that are playing well now, that are going to add to the team that you have already. As I've seen many people talk about, you have to have that blend of players that are there right now that have that experience, alongside those ones that are coming up, say, through the academy as well. Throw on top of that the fact that they can't quite nail down a head of recruitment. It does look a little bit like a mess at the moment, and you can't really be too optimistic about what's going on there. Of course, I do like that idea, and I do like the long-term development, recruiting young, building towards that. The problem is, I think, in a lot of the ways, and I always look, and I feel like I'm quite critical on clubs, on teams, critical now of Southampton. I've been critical of Aston Villa as well. The clubs now, the top clubs that use data analytics to can identify talent really well for such a small price and build that well into the team, have a solid identity of how they play, a way of playing, and build towards that. Everything's so cohesive throughout the entire unit. When I look at teams like Southampton, you have to do it really well. You have to do that really well. And you can poke a lot of holes in the logic of what Southampton are doing at the moment, and that may be a problem going forward. However, this is a new ownership. It has just come in place. Yes, they're just changing the manager. There are big changes happening behind the scenes of the club. Whether that's going to eventually lead to a good thing or a bad thing, it's hard to see yet. I think my conclusion is, while I can see a lot of what Southampton is trying to do, and I admire them a lot for the recruiting young and everything like that, there's a lot of logic that I can poke holes in that. I think Ralph Hasenhüttl should have gone a long time ago, last season especially, towards the last run of games. Everybody knew the direction that was going. They were favourites to go down this season as well as they were favourites to go down last season also. It didn't look good, and you did need to make changes then. It's taken a while to make those changes. Changing the recruitment now as well doesn't look great, and I look at it more and more. I still think they will be probably one of the favourites to go down. The position that they're in isn't a great one, and maybe it's a situation where they go down to the Championship, and as they do, recruit young, rebuild, and actually develop something really good. And yeah, that's everything. Thank you for watching and listening. What do you think about Southampton, about their sacking of Ralph Hasenhüttl? Do you think they'll be going down this season? Thank you for watching and listening as always. If you could like, if you could subscribe, if you could review the podcast if you're listening to it, that would be fantastic. And I will see you again next week.